He thought he was demanding submission from a terrified maid. He didn't know he had just struck a former national MMA champion and she was about to show him what real dominance looks like. The luxury banquet hall hummed with the quiet arrogance of immense wealth. Beneath the glow of a grand chandelier, Lilah moved like a ghost. Her survival rule was simple: remain completely invisible. Clad in a crisp black and white uniform, her hair pulled into a sleek bun, she navigated a room filled with the city's most dangerous men. Standing at the center was Jang Joo-chan. With slick-back hair, a sharp black suit, and tattoos climbing his neck, he radiated cold, controlled aggression. The fragile illusion of safety shattered when a drunken rival intentionally shoved past Lilah, sending red wine crashing onto Joo-chan's immaculate jacket. The hall fell dead silent. Assuming she was just a careless servant, Joo-chan's jaw tightened. With flashing authority, he delivered a sharp, dismissive slap to her cheek. He expected her to break. Instead, Lilah simply locked her calm, steady gaze onto his. When he gripped her wrist to force her down, he triggered a lethal reflex. In a single blur of flawless motion, she was about to upend the entire hierarchy of the Korean underworld. Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. Where are you watching from? Like, comment, and share. The Grand Elysium Banquet Hall was a glittering cage for the city's most ruthless predators, disguised in tailored tuxedos and draped in heavy silk. For the past 3 years, Lilah had survived this world by mastering the art of becoming part of the wallpaper. She wore the standard black and white maid uniform, complete with pristine white gloves, her dark hair pulled tightly into a sleek, severe bun. Her movements as she navigated the crowded room were mechanical, precise, and completely devoid of the explosive athletic power that had once made her a national champion. In the octagon, she had been a highly decorated warrior. Here, she was nothing more than a ghost. The rules of the high society underworld were absolute. Serve the champagne from the left, clear the crystal from the right, and never under any circumstances make direct eye contact with the guests. These weren't simply arrogant billionaires, they were the architects of the criminal elite. A misplaced word or a lingering stare could cost a server their livelihood or their life. Lilah understood discipline better than anyone in the room. She kept her chin tucked, her breathing measured, and her presence entirely muted. It was a suffocating existence, but it was safe. The men hunting her couldn't find a woman who refused to exist. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance swung open, and the air in the opulent room grew instantly thin. The low hum of string instruments and the clinking of expensive glassware faded into an anxious hush. Even the most hardened, arrogant men in the room stopped talking, straightening their postures and lowering their heads. Jang Joo-chan had arrived. He didn't merely walk into the banquet, he consumed the space. Flanked by 4 silent enforcers, he moved with the predatory grace of an apex predator profoundly bored by his surroundings. He wore a sharp obsidian black suit that looked carved onto his broad frame, his dark hair slicked back with meticulous care. But it was the ink creeping up his neck and dusting the skin of his knuckles that commanded immediate, paralyzing fear. They were the permanent markings of a man who had not simply inherited a criminal empire but had violently conquered it. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line of tension, and his dark eyes swept over the room, dismissing everyone he saw as utterly insignificant. He radiated a terrifying aura of dominance and tightly controlled aggression. Lilah felt the shift in gravity from across the hall. She kept her head angled down, balancing a heavy silver tray of drinks with hands that had once shattered ribs. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The raw power radiating from the Korean Mafia boss was a heavy physical weight pressing down on the room. All she had to do was remain perfectly invisible for a few more hours. Just serve the drinks, keep her eyes fixed on the marble floor, and return to her quiet, hidden life. But the brutal reality of the world she was hiding in was about to catch up with her. The tray of crystal goblets was heavy, but Lilah carried it with the effortless balance of an athlete used to bearing much worse. She navigated the narrow spaces between the silk-draped tables, her eyes deliberately anchored to the floorboards. She was only 10 feet away from the epicenter of the room's tension, Jang Joo-chan. He stood with his back to her, speaking in low, measured tones to a terrified city official. It happened in a fraction of a second. A rival syndicate boss, flushed and reeking of expensive scotch, stumbled violently backward. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated display of disrespect aimed at Joo-chan's proximity, using the passing server as collateral. The heavy man slammed hard into Lilah's shoulder, throwing her off balance. Lilah could have braced herself. She could have dropped her center of gravity, pivoted, and sent the drunken man crashing to the floor. But muscle memory warred with her cardinal rule: stay invisible. She forced herself to stumble like a normal waitress. The silver tray tipped. 3 crystal goblets shattered against the polished marble, but not before a dark wave of vintage red wine splashed directly across the sleeve and torso of Jang Joo-chan's immaculate black suit. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The silence that swept through the grand hall was sudden, absolute, and suffocating. Joo-chan turned slowly. He didn't look at the smirking rival boss who had caused the collision. He looked down at his ruined jacket, and then his dark, hollow gaze shifted to the servant standing before him. His jaw tightened into a lethal line. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature, freezing the breath in the lungs of the onlookers. To him, she was nothing more than a careless, insignificant maid in a black and white uniform. Without a word, without a shift in his chillingly composed expression, Joo-chan raised his hand. The slap was a sharp, echoing crack that cut through the dead silence of the room. It was a strike meant to dismiss, to humiliate, to break her spirit instantly. The elite guests held their breath, waiting for the girl to crumble to her knees and weep for mercy. But Lilah didn't fall, she didn't cry out. Her head had snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow, but when she slowly turned her face back to him, the terrified maid was gone. Her dark eyes were entirely cold. They locked onto his with a steady, calculating intensity that made the enforcers across the room tense up. It was a look of absolute, unblinking defiance. Infuriated by her lack of submission, Joo-chan stepped forward, his tattooed hand aggressively gripping her wrist to physically force her to the floor. That was his fatal mistake. He breached her striking distance. The ghost vanished and the national champion awoke. In a terrifying blur of fluid motion, Lilah didn't pull away. She stepped into his guard. She slipped her arm under his grip, pivoting her hips with explosive power, and swept his lead leg out from under him. As his balance vanished, she manipulated his extended arm, twisting it sharply behind his back into a bone-straining, inescapable Kimura lock. The invincible Mafia boss was suddenly paralyzed, forced into a humiliating, agonizing hold in front of the city's elite. Lilah leaned in close, her voice a calm, chilling whisper that carried through the stunned room. "Apologize," she said in flawless, unaccented Korean. The adrenaline was a liar. It promised invincibility, but it always left a bitter, trembling crash in its wake. Lilah didn't wait for the banquet hall to fully erupt into chaos. The moment Jang Joo-chan's enforcers had surged forward to break her unbreakable hold, she had melted back into the shadows, slipping through the service corridors and vanishing into the night. She knew the golden rule of her hidden existence was permanently shattered. The ghost was dead. Inside her cramped, dimly lit apartment, she moved with surgical efficiency. A fake passport, stacks of emergency cash, and a burner phone were swiftly shoved into a worn duffel bag. She had outrun the Ghost Syndicate for 3 years by staying 3 steps ahead, but tonight she had exposed herself to a completely different breed of predator. She stepped out into the damp, rain-slicked alleyway, pulling the collar of her jacket up against the chill. She didn't make it past the first street lamp. Twin beams of blinding white light cut through the darkness as a sleek black sedan blocked the narrow exit. Behind her, the heavy hum of a second engine signaled the trap snapping shut. 4 men stepped out into the rain. They didn't draw weapons and they didn't shout. They were the silent, lethal shadows who had flanked Joo-chan at the gala. Lilah's mind instantly calculated the violence required to escape. She could break the first 2, maybe disarm the third, but the 4th would end it. Her athletic dominance was useless against a coordinated, armed execution. Exhaling a slow, steady breath, she dropped her duffel bag onto the wet asphalt. The running was over. However, the execution never came. Instead of a shallow grave, the silent men escorted her into the back of the luxury vehicle. 30 minutes later, the private elevator doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a penthouse suspended high above the glittering city. The space was a reflection of the man who owned it, cold, immaculate, and aggressively dominant. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a sweeping view of the empire he ruled, but Lilah's eyes remained locked on the center of the room. Jang Joo-chan stood beside a black marble wet bar. He had discarded the ruined suit jacket, the sleeves of his dark dress shirt pushed up to reveal the intricate, terrifying ink snaking across his forearms. He didn't look like a man who had just been publicly humiliated. He looked entirely fascinated. He poured a glass of amber liquid, the clink of crystal sharply breaking the heavy silence. He turned, his dark eyes analyzing her not as a servant but as a weapon he had just unearthed. Without a word, he picked up a thin manila folder from the counter and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. The folder slid to a stop, flipping open to reveal a glossy photograph of Lilah from 3 years ago, her hands raised in a championship victory. The physical altercation was over, but as his cold, calculating gaze met her defiant stare, a far more dangerous psychological game began. He didn't want her dead. He wanted to use the weapon that had brought him to his knees. The silence in the penthouse stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken violence. Lilah stared at the glossy photograph of her former self resting on the glass table, then slowly raised her eyes to meet Jang Joo-chan's. He didn't look angry, he looked dangerously intrigued. He leaned against the black marble wet bar, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass before finally breaking the quiet. His voice was a low, velvet baritone, completely devoid of the explosive fury she expected from a humiliated king. Instead of handing down a death sentence, he offered her a lethal proposition. He laid out the grim reality of the city's rapidly fracturing underbelly. In exactly 3 weeks, the major criminal factions were convening for a once-in-a-decade syndicate summit. On paper, it was a diplomatic negotiation regarding territory lines, but Joo-chan's intelligence networks had intercepted a much darker narrative. It was a coordinated slaughter. The Ghost Syndicate, the very same ruthless organization that had destroyed Lilah's fighting career and placed a permanent, paralyzing target on her back, was orchestrating a hostile takeover. They planned to assassinate Joo-chan at the table and swallow his empire whole. "My usual security will be expected and accounted for," Joo-chan explained, his dark, calculating eyes never leaving hers. "They know my men, they know our operational tactics, but they do not know you." He took a slow sip from his glass, stepping closer until the faint scent of expensive cedar and cold rain invaded her space. He didn't just want a fighter, he wanted a phantom. He needed a personal vanguard who looked entirely unassuming but possessed the devastating striking power to dismantle elite killers in a matter of seconds. In exchange for acting as his elite bodyguard and keeping him alive through the summit, Joo-chan made a vow. He would use his surviving empire to completely eradicate the Ghost Syndicate, permanently erasing the bounty on Lilah's head and buying her true freedom. It was a devil's bargain, trading a life of quiet hiding for the epicenter of a mafia war. Lilah didn't blink. She didn't retreat from his imposing, tattooed frame. 3 years of looking over her shoulder had exhausted her soul, and the opportunity to finally sever the chains of her traumatic past was an intoxicating lure. But she refused to simply trade one oppressive master for another. She straightened her posture, the invisible, subservient waitress permanently shedding her disguise. "If I do this," Lilah stated, her voice as hard and uncompromising as the steel beams holding up the penthouse, "I am not your employee, I am not your maid, and I will never bow to you or your lieutenants." She took a deliberate step into his personal space, challenging the power dynamic once again. "I answer to no one. I control the security perimeters, I dictate the engagement protocols, and if you want my protection, you will have to earn my respect." For a suspended heartbeat, the room felt dangerously volatile. A mafia boss accustomed to absolute, unquestioning obedience was being given ultimatums by the woman who had publicly assaulted him hours prior. Then a slow, genuinely fascinated smirk curved the corner of Joo-chan's mouth. The cold-hearted alpha didn't demand her submission. Instead, he poured a second glass of premium whiskey, slid it across the glass table toward her, and silently accepted the terms of his dangerous new equal. The subterranean training facility beneath Jang Joo-chan's estate was a cathedral of concrete and steel, smelling faintly of chalk and cold aggression. For the next 2 weeks, it became a psychological battleground. Lilah didn't just train to protect the mafia boss, she systematically dismantled his entire approach to combat. She moved with a terrifying, calculated grace, her strikes on the heavy pads echoing like gunshots through the cavernous room. But it was the quiet moments between the violence that permanently shifted the balance of power. Joo-chan was a man accustomed to being the absolute center of gravity. He spent hours watching her from the periphery, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes tracking the lethal fluidity of her footwork. He had initially assumed her dominance in the banquet hall was a momentary flare of pure athletic reflex. He was profoundly mistaken. The true depth of her threat revealed itself during a tactical review of the upcoming summit. Spread across a wide glass table were the architectural blueprints of the Red Lantern estate, the fortified site of the syndicate meeting. Joo-chan's lieutenants argued heatedly over extraction points, speaking in rapid, complex Korean dialects, intentionally attempting to isolate and overwhelm the outsider. Lilah stood perfectly still, her eyes scanning the ink lines of the blueprints. "The eastern corridor is a kill box," she stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the men's loud chatter. She didn't bother to look up, casually sliding a red marker across their primary escape route. "If the Ghost Syndicate triggers an ambush at the main table, they will funnel your men there. It's a blind choke point. They don't need to breach your security perimeter, they just need to wait for you to panic and run directly into the crossfire." The lieutenants bristled at the correction, turning to their boss, expecting him to silence the insolent bodyguard. Instead, Joo-chan raised a single heavily inked hand, mooting his men instantly. He stepped up to the table, closing the distance until he was standing so close to Lilah that the heat radiating from his chest ghosted against her shoulder. The heavy tension in the room condensed entirely into the narrow space between them. "And your countermeasure?" Joo-chan murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre meant only for her. Lilah slowly turned her head, her dark, composed eyes locked onto his, entirely unfazed by his overwhelming proximity. "We don't retreat," she replied calmly. "We collapse the room. You hold the high ground near the northern pillars and I turn the primary entrance into a bottleneck. We break their momentum before they can draw their weapons." Joo-chan stared at her in silence. The slow-burn electricity crackling between them was no longer born from a physical threat. It was the intoxicating collision of two apex predators realizing they spoke the exact same language. He saw the cold, brilliant calculation in her gaze, a mind sharpened by survival and hardened by the octagon. She wasn't just a physical shield forged of muscle and bone. She was a tactical genius capable of commanding a war. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke the stoic mask of the cold-hearted boss. He didn't see an invisible waitress anymore, he saw a lethal equal. The Red Lantern estate loomed against the night sky, a sprawling fortress of traditional crimson timber and reinforced glass. Black SUVs crawled up the private mountain pass, delivering the most ruthless men in the criminal underworld to the decennial syndicate summit. The air inside the grand pavilion was thick with the scent of burning sandalwood and the quiet, lethal arrogance of powerful men. When Jang Joo-chan stepped through the heavy sliding doors, the low hum of conversation stopped entirely. He wore a charcoal suit, the dark ink on his neck a stark warning against his crisp white collar. But the eyes of the rival bosses quickly shifted from the king to the shadow walking a half-step behind him. Lilah had traded her black and white maid's uniform for a tailored midnight blue tactical suit that hugged her athletic frame. Her hair was braided back tightly to the scalp. She carried no visible firearms, her empty hands resting relaxed at her sides. To the untrained eye, she looked entirely out of place among the hulking, heavily armed mercenaries guarding the other tables. At the massive mahogany round table, a scarred lieutenant from the Dragon Triad scoffed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a thick cloud of cigar smoke directly into Lilah's path. "Joo-chan," the man mocked in heavily accented Korean, intentionally attempting to humiliate the boss in front of his peers. "Did your best men abandon you? You brought a foreign servant to a war council. Perhaps she is here to pour the tea." Joo-chan didn't flinch, he didn't even look at the man. He simply pulled out his chair and sat, casually unbuttoning his suit jacket. He was giving Lilah the floor. Lilah didn't blink. She stepped forward, her footsteps completely silent on the woven tatami mats. She stopped mere inches from the Triad lieutenant. The man smirked, clearly expecting the woman to shrink away from his aggressive posturing. Instead, Lilah leaned down, her eyes entirely devoid of fear, her voice a smooth, chilling blade cutting through the heavy smoke. "I pour tea for men who know how to conceal their weapons," Lilah stated in flawless, unaccented Mandarin, sending a shockwave around the table. She casually tapped 2 fingers against the underside of the lieutenant's left lapel, exactly where his hand had been nervously hovering since she entered the room. "A ceramic blade taped to the inner rib. It is an amateur placement. If you reach for it, you drop your defensive guard for exactly 1.2 seconds. I only need half a second to crush your windpipe." The lieutenant froze. The color rapidly drained from his scarred face as his hand hovered uselessly in the air, exposed and paralyzed. The rest of the table fell dead silent, the room's casual arrogance evaporating into a sudden, suffocating cold sweat. Lilah straightened her posture, her dark, calculating gaze sweeping over the rest of the room, silently daring anyone else to test her. No one breathed a word. She stepped back into her position behind Joo-chan's right shoulder. The Korean boss finally smiled, a dark, devastating curve of his lips as he poured his own tea. The summit hadn't even officially begun and his vanguard had already conquered the room. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the pavilion slid open, and the temperature in the room seemingly plummeted. The leader of the Ghost Syndicate finally stepped into the light. He was an older man, his face a map of pale, jagged scars, walking with a deceptive, predatory slowness. For 3 years, that face had haunted Lilah's nightmares. He was the architect of her ruin, the man who had ordered her to throw the national championship fight, and the ruthless monster who had placed a permanent bounty on her head when she refused to submit. Lilah's breath hitched, a microscopic fracture in her ironclad composure. She shifted her weight, her muscle memory instinctively dropping her into a balanced, defensive stance just behind Jang Joo-chan's chair. The Ghost Syndicate leader didn't immediately address the Korean Mafia boss at the table. His hollow eyes bypassed the men of power and locked directly onto the woman standing in the shadows. A slow, chilling smile stretched across his scarred face. "Well," the syndicate leader rasped, his voice cutting through the dead silence of the summit. "I must commend your intelligence gathering, Joo-chan. You found my lost property. I have spent 3 years and a fortune hunting down the little champion who refused to bleed for me." The rival bosses murmured, the tension in the room ratcheting to a dangerous, volatile high. The ghost leader took a deliberate step forward, his eyes burning with toxic ownership. "Hand her over. Her contract still belongs to the Ghost Syndicate. Deliver her to my men right now, and perhaps I will graciously allow you to keep your shipping routes." Lilah's muscles coiled like a striking viper. She was fully prepared to fight her way out of the fortress, even if it meant tearing through the entire room single-handedly. But before she could move, Jang Joo-chan slowly stood up. He didn't draw a weapon, he didn't raise his voice. He simply buttoned his charcoal suit jacket with terrifying, deliberate calm, placing his large, tattooed frame entirely between Lilah and the syndicate leader. "You are gravely mistaken," Joo-chan stated, his velvet baritone carrying a lethal, uncompromising weight. "She is no one's property, and her contract was bought in full exactly 3 years ago." The ghost leader halted, his confident smirk faltering into confusion. "Impossible." The anonymous buyer withdrew the moment she vanished. Joo-chan stepped forward, the heavy, dominant aura of the alpha male flooding the room. He didn't look at the rival boss. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his dark, intense gaze finding Lilah's shocked eyes over his shoulder. "The buyer never withdrew," Joo-chan murmured softly, the profound revelation wrapping around her even as the room listened in stunned silence. He simply couldn't find the woman he had spent $10 million to protect. The ground beneath Lilah completely tilted on its axis. The fractured pieces of her past violently slammed into place. The anonymous billionaire benefactor who had secretly tried to buy out her corrupt contract, the faceless savior she thought had abandoned her when she went into hiding, was the cold-hearted mafia boss standing before her. He hadn't just stumbled upon a skilled fighter at the banquet hall. He had instantly recognized the unbroken spirit of the champion he had admired from afar for years. The emotional shift within Lilah was seismic. The man she thought was merely using her as a shield had actually been her invisible protector all along. Joo-chan slowly turned his attention back to the ghost leader. The cold, calculating indifference in his eyes had vanished, replaced by pure murderous intent. The psychological game was over. The war had just begun. The revelation hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the Ghost Syndicate leader's scarred face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, echoing crack that shattered the diplomatic facade of the summit. The heavy wooden doors of the pavilion slammed shut, the metallic locks engaging with a heavy thud. From the shadows of the paper-screened corridors, a dozen elite mercenaries surged forward, drawing concealed weapons and extending telescopic batons. The ambush was officially triggered. Chaos erupted. Rival bosses scrambled for cover beneath the mahogany tables, overturning plates and spilling hot tea, but Lilah and Jang Joo-chan moved with terrifying synchronization. The psychological shock of his revelation fueled a sudden, explosive clarity within her. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore, she was fighting for the man who had secretly protected her from the shadows. "Northern Pillars!" Lilah shouted, her voice slicing cleanly through the cacophony of shouting men and breaking porcelain. Joo-chan didn't hesitate or argue. Trusting her tactical command implicitly, he drew his sidearm and moved swiftly to the high ground, holding the perimeter while Lilah stepped directly into the primary bottleneck. As the first wave of Ghost Syndicate fighters rushed her, fully expecting an easy kill, the invisible Waitress permanently vanished and the national champion was unleashed. The lead mercenary swung a heavy steel baton aimed directly at her temple. Lilah slipped the strike with a millimeter to spare, stepping into his guard and delivering a devastating elbow to his jaw that sent him crashing senseless to the tatami mats. She didn't pause to watch him fall. She was a masterclass in kinetic energy, flowing from one attacker to the next with brutal, surgical precision. A second fighter lunged, attempting to grapple her. She redirected his momentum, securing his arm and flipping him over her shoulder in a flawless judo throw that cracked the floorboards. She fought not with blind anger but with the cold, calculating mathematics of the octagon. She dismantled stances, disabled limbs, and controlled the space, turning the narrow corridor into a devastating trap. But the ghost leader was a desperate man. Realizing his elite guards were being systematically dismantled by a single unarmed woman, he pulled a compact firearm from his coat. Bypassing Lilah entirely, he aimed directly at Joo-chan's exposed flank as the Mafia boss reloaded his weapon. Lilah caught the metallic glint in her peripheral vision. Time seemed to fracture. She abandoned the mercenary in front of her, sprinting across the matted floor with explosive athletic speed. She didn't just throw herself into the line of fire, she weaponized her momentum. Launching herself off a shattered wooden bench, she executed a flawless flying knee strike that connected violently with the ghost leader's chest just as his finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot went wildly off course, burying itself into the ceiling as the syndicate leader collapsed to the floor, completely incapacitated. The remaining mercenaries froze, their weapons lowering in absolute shock as they stared at their fallen boss. The grand pavilion fell deathly quiet, save for the sound of Lilah's measured breathing. She stood victorious over the monster who had haunted her for 3 years, her dark eyes fierce and unbroken. As Joo-chan lowered his gun, his gaze locked onto hers, burning with an overwhelming, absolute reverence. She hadn't just saved his life, she had conquered his enemies. The heavy oak doors of the Red Lantern Pavilion finally opened to the cool night air, but no one ran. The surviving rival bosses sat in stunned, absolute silence, staring at the wreckage of the Ghost Syndicate scattered across the tatami mats. The man who had terrorized Lilah for 3 years was being dragged away into the darkness by Jang Joo-chan's enforcers, his corrupt empire systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes. The oppressive, suffocating shadow that had haunted her every step was permanently erased. Joo-chan holstered his weapon and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The terrifying, untouchable aura of the cold-hearted boss had softened into a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He stopped mere inches away, his dark eyes tracing the faint bruise on her jawline. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his ruined charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick, black envelope. He held it out to her. Inside was absolute freedom, a flawless new identity, untraceable offshore funds, and a one-way ticket out of the underworld. He had kept his devil's bargain. The debt was paid, and the invisible waitress was finally free to disappear in luxury. Lilah looked at the heavy envelope, then slowly raised her steady, composed gaze to meet his. For 3 grueling years she had equated hiding with safety. But as she stood amid the ruins of her past, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and adrenaline, she realized that true safety was never found in the shadows. It was found in the light, standing unapologetically in her own power. She looked at the man who had spent millions to secretly protect her, the king who had just watched her conquer a room of monsters, and looked at her not with fear, but with profound, unconditional reverence. She didn't take the envelope. Instead, Lilah stepped into his space, her hand reaching up to rest firmly against the dark ink on his chest, right over his heart. "I'm done running," she stated, her voice a calm, unbreakable vow that echoed through the quiet pavilion. "But I don't stand behind anyone. If I stay in this city, I take a seat at the table." Joo-chan looked down at her, the last remnants of his mafia arrogance completely melting away. A dark, devastatingly genuine smile curved his lips as he let the envelope slip from his fingers, dropping it onto the blood-stained floorboards. He didn't just accept her terms, he surrendered to them completely. He reached up, his large hand gently covering hers, sealing a dangerous pact that no rival syndicate would ever dare to challenge. The cold-hearted alpha had finally found his equal, and the invisible girl had officially become a queen. The moral of the story is that true respect cannot be demanded through fear or force. It is earned when you have the courage to stand in your own power, and true strength lies in recognizing an equal. What did you think of Lilah's choice? Should she have taken the money and started over, or was demanding an equal seat at the table the ultimate boss move? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you loved this slow burn power shift, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Empire Romance Tales for more high-stakes stories.